Welcome back to the Versatile PC channel. In today's video, we do a CPU scaling test using the non-X3D CPUs on the AM5 platform. For the CPUs we went through today are the Ryzen 5 7600X, which is equivalent in gaming performance to the Ryzen 5 9600X and the Ryzen 5 7500F. We also used the Ryzen 7 7700X, which is equivalent to the 9700X and the 7700 non-X variants. And then we also went and used the Ryzen 9 7900X, which is equivalent to the 9900X in gaming performance. We also used the Ryzen 9 7900X, which is equivalent in gaming performance to the 9900X, basically. So for graphics cards, we paired it with the 9070 XT from Radeon. We also, and then from the Nvidia side, we used the RTX 5070Ti. So let's go ahead and jump into our benchmark data. As always, we do all these testing. We use 3 different games at the lowest settings, 3 different resolutions. We use 1080p, 1440p, and 4K for all games. We did use all their built-in benchmarks just to keep the runs consistent. As far as our test platform, we used the MSI Tomahawk X670. We used T-Force Delta RAM DDR5 CL28 is 6000 megahertz. Black Myth Wukong built-in benchmark at 1080p low settings. The 7600X and the 5070Ti was able to do 193 average FPS. The 7600X and 9070 XT did 191 average FPS, so pretty much identical performance. A little bit lower on the Radeon GPUs, as you see across basically almost every platform. 7700X and 5070Ti did 201 average FPS. With the 7700X, the 9070 XT seems to be a little bit quicker. Not by much though, not by a severe margin, but a little bit. So the 7700X 9070 XT was able to do 204 average FPS. So in this scenario, you're very much a little bit of CPU performance difference there between the 7600X and the 7700X. However, with the 7900X, there's again another almost 10 FPS difference in the performance. With 7900X 5070Ti doing 213. The 7900X and the 9070 XT did 212 average FPS, so again a little bit of performance over the 7700X platform, or over the 7700X CPU, but again not huge gains. Now when it goes to Black Myth Wukong at 1440p low settings, we see the 7600X able to do 190. Again, basically some tied performance with the 1080p results, basically the same performance. 7600X, 970XT, again 190. So again, within run-to-run variants, so should be heavily CPU limited here. 7700X, 5070Ti was able to do 198. The 7700XT, 9070XT was able to do 198. Both identical performance. The 7900X with the 5070Ti was able to do 212 average FPS. The 7900X and 9070XT was able to do 208 average FPS. So again, pretty much close performance here. 7600X at 4K was able to do 186 average FPS. So you do see a little bit more GPU demanding parts here, but nothing where it's going to drop it significantly. So it's still mostly CPU limited throughout this test. The results are pretty much the same at 4K as they are at 1440p and 1080p. So moving over to my rivals at 1080p low settings. 7600X with the 5070Ti was able to do 173 average FPS. The 7600X 9070 XT was able to do 177 average FPS. The 7700X with the 5070Ti was able to do 178 average FPS. The 7700X and the 9070 XT was able to do 181 average FPS. The 7900X with the 5070Ti was able to do 185 average FPS. The 7900X 9070 XT was able to do 183 average FPS. Well, I think with the 7600X and the 7700X CPUs combined with the GPUs, I just believe that there's a kind of a little bit of a CPU overhead issue when it comes to the 2 Nvidia cards. But we'll see that more in the future here. So the 7600X and 5070Ti at 1440p in Marvel Rivals was able to do 170 average FPS. The 7600X 9070 XT was able to do 175 average FPS. So again, not much of a difference in performance. This should still be very limited in the same way. The 7700X 9070 XT and the 7700X 5070Ti were basically able to do this pretty much similar performance as they were at 1080p is a RX 1440p. It's 7900X 5070 Ti at 180 average FPS, and the 7900X with a 9070 XT was able to do 177 average FPS, which is again a little bit lower performance than they were with the at 1080p, but again pretty similar performance. And at 4K is where we become heavily GPU limited across all CPUs here, all CPUs tested. 7600X 5070 Ti did 122 average FPS, 7600X 9070 XT did 120 average FPS. The 7700X with the 5070 Ti did about 124 average FPS. The 7700 XT with 9070 XT was able to do 121 average FPS. The 7900X with the 5070 Ti did 125 average FPS. The 7900X with the 9070 XT was able to do 120 average FPS. So this is typical performance variation when you see inside of marble rifles. You generally see the Nvidia cards performing slightly better to a little bit slightly better. So moving on to Black Ops, you see these two different lines here on every option, whereas previously we didn't see that. I showed in the last video why we have both these lines, because in the built-in benchmark for the Call of Duty Black Ops 6 there is a CPU rendering metric that it shows, so we include that as well, because the the benchmark caps out at 300 average FPS, which in these scenarios none of them are able to hit that, but in the X3D CPUs they were able to hit that, so that's why we kept both lines here, just for comparison as well. So at 7600X with the 5070 Ti, the average FPS was 222, but the throughput that the CPU was able to put through was 226 average FPS when it paired with the Nvidia graphics card. But however, with the 7600X 9070 XT, when it was able to be paired with a Radeon GPU, it performs slightly better, the 239 average FPS. So you see a big performance uplift when being paired with a Radeon GPU than you do with the Nvidia GPU, due to the CPU overhead issue that the Nvidia GPUs do experience when being CPU limited. So if you move down to the 7600X, when pairing the 7600X with the Radeon GPU, it basically matches the performance of the 7700X with a Nvidia GPU when being CPU limited. So with 7700X 5070 Ti, you see 232 average FPS across the benchmark, but the 7700X is only able to throughput 240 FPS, whereas if you pair it with a Radeon GPU like the 9070 XT, it's able to throughput 248 average FPS. The 7900X with the 5070 Ti is able to do 232 average FPS, while the CPU is able to throughput 243. Near identical performance to the 7700X, and the 7900X with the 9070 XT is able to put through 240 average FPS. So the 7700X is technically the better value CPU in this instance when paired with the Radeon GPU. If you're pairing it with a Nvidia GPU, it's still the better value part here, where the 9700X basically would perform identical to the 7700X. Moving on to 1440p, the Black Ops 6 benchmark, you see the 7600X with the 5070 Ti able to perform very similar to what it was at 1080p. Average FPS is slightly lower, 204, but the CPU throughput still 230 FPS. And with the 7600X 9070 XT, the average FPS is 230, but the throughput is still 240, so it's pretty much identical. Then run variants. The 7700X with the 5070 Ti is able to throughput 205 average FPS, but the CPU is able to do 240, which was identical to the previous performance. 7700X with the 9070 XT is able to do 233 average FPS, but the CPU is able to throughput 244, which is pretty much identical to the previous. Well, it's a little bit lower than the previous one, but it's pretty much the same. Within run variants, the 7900X with 9070 XT is able to throughput 235 average FPS, with the CPU being able to render 242 average or 242 FPS. The Black Ops 6 at 4K is able to do 7600X. Probably change this, but 4K 7600X 5070 Ti definitely becomes very CPU. Really, with Call of Duty Black Ops 6 built-in benchmarks at 4K definitely becomes very GPU limited, as you see across the board. You see very much same performance across the board. You do see the Radeon GPUs performing significantly better in this title, which is common across all Radeon GPUs. But the 5070 Ti is able to throughput 127 average FPS, basically across all 3 CPUs. And the Radeon GPU is able to throughput 156 to 162 average FPS across all CPUs. But when you see the actual CPU rendering differences, you see the Radeon GPU being able to get more FPS out of the CPU than you do with the Nvidia GPU. So I think that's very much indicative that the Radeon the Nvidia it's very much indicative that the Nvidia GPUs have a weird CPU overhead issue, similar to what we've seen with the Intel Arc cards. To what extent we will look into this in the future, but for right now, this is where our CPU scaling seems to come out at. There you have it. There's the results. We're testing generally when it comes to the non-X3D CPUs. There's not too much of a gaming performance difference when it comes from the 7600X all the way up to the 7900X. There's a big price difference, but not a very big gaming performance difference, especially when the higher you go in terms of resolution. At 4K, they're basically all the same because you're going to be primarily with these GPUs, you're primarily going to be GPU limited in most titles. Even in generally CPU demanding titles, you're going to be more GPU limited at 4K. 1440p is kind of a back and forth kind of deal, and at 1080p you tend to be CPU limited on these cards on the lower end CPUs, and the higher end CPUs you tend to be more GPU limited. Price difference with the 7600X and the 9600X compared to the 7700X and definitely the 7900 and 9900X. Definitely would say that the 7600X is probably the best price to performance CPU you can buy that's non-X3D. So there you go, there you have it. If you guys enjoyed this video, please make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.